So, we're going to talk a little bit about what happened. We're going to talk about where were we. We're going to talk about where are we, and most importantly, what is next. So let's go ahead and dive right in. I've broken this webinar into three categories: tariffs, labor shortages, and supply chain risks. But really, we want to know, what is their impact going to be on the construction site. When you hear me talk about tariffs, for example, no offense to vehicles, jewelry, and clothing, but we're here to talk about construction. We're here to talk about construction costs, development costs, and how all of these things impact what it is we do every day. So let's start off talking about labor shortages. First of all, I do believe that this is something that has gotten brushed aside and under the rug over the last few years because of, coming out of COVID, and then most notably over the last 12, 14 months because of tariffs. And I think this is an absolutely key subject that we need to be talking about: labor shortages. It was an issue from 2024 to 2025. It's still an issue from 2025 into 2026. I'm going to show you a few numbers, but let's talk about what it is and how it applies to you. The other thing I'll tell you before we dive into this webinar today is I really like to think that the information you're about to see is two parts. One is the nerdy, geeky part, which is stuff I Googled, used AI, read an article, statistics, numbers, what people that are smarter and more researched than I am on this stuff have told me via their channels, social media, articles, etc. I'm just a humble construction and building inspector. I'm not an economist. I'm not a financial analyst. But I can read and I can connect dots. So the first part of what I'm going to talk to you about today is really the numbers, what we're seeing out there, and what people are reporting. Those are the black and white statistics, numbers, etc. And the second part, and equally as important, is, and this is where we do have an advantage, what are we actually hearing and seeing out on the construction site? So that I'm going to bring to you as well, via stories, via comments. It's one thing for me to tell you, hey, copper futures are up 6% last month. Okay, that's fine. It's another thing for me to tell you, for example, when I remember coming out of the Great Recession, when metals spiked, going to job sites, and theft was out of control. People were going in and ripping copper out of walls. Why? Scrap metal, salvage. I mean, I remember Philadelphia, they had a problem with people taking manhole covers because they could sell it for scrap. You know, those are the real world stories. True story, by the way. Those are the real world stories that I'm going to bring you as well. So let's kind of look at it through those two lenses. One is the macro, what do we know? What have we learned? And two is the micro, what are we hearing and seeing on site? The other thing I'll tell you, particularly if you're a hard money lender or in that space as we are representing you, your best friend is the boots on the ground. And it's all about who's actually getting this job done. Who is the means and methods? And I think it's something to keep in mind as we enter this. I had a new employee that I had join me. He's on the energy side for a few months on a job, just because he wanted to see what we did on the construction side. And I said, what do you think? And he said, I can't believe how big the means and methods are to what we're doing. And the means and methods are everything. I could show you blueprints, specs, and a contract till you're blue in the face. But how are you going to get this done? That's what I want to bring to you. So labor shortages, why is this an issue? Why is this something that's a problem? Well, number one, we have an aging population. And I don't need to tell any of you that. You can go look at the numbers all day long about boomers and an aging population, and smaller groups that are behind them that are not replacing them, certainly not one-to-one. Another issue is we have a lack of skilled workforce entering the trades. This is a problem. I'm going to go over some numbers in a moment, but it is an issue. When I say skilled, I borrowed that term. I don't love that term. That's what most people would consider licensed trades: plumbing, mechanical, electrical, fire alarm, fire sprinkler, elevator. We really have a lack of all employees, but we certainly have a lack of skilled workforce entering the trades. So that's an impact. That's a big impact. Number three, or number four here, impact on costs and schedules. Remember, everything affects costs. If you have a schedule impact, you have a cost impact. Let's just use a very, very simple term. If I'm going on a construction site month after month, and I get there and they say, hey, we're going to be delayed 3 months, and I say, why? And they say, oh, well, we did something wrong with the utilities and we have to move it, or some error happened. And they say, but don't worry, it's just a schedule delay. It's not going to cost anymore. It is going to cost anymore. It's 3 more months of general conditions, supervision, permits, sidewalk shed, profit, overhead. So really everything affects costs. And so when you affect your schedule, which is directly related to your labor potential, you affect your cost. And then the last one is ICE and the deportation of workers. It's been an impact. This is mostly an on-site construction, warehouse, service industries, farmland, which we're not covering that here, but we have seen it make a difference. Every project? No, not every project, but I've certainly seen it on some of the projects. And I'll tell you, I had a project recently. Here's the micro story, but thank you, Lucas. This is a good slide. I had a project recently where I showed up and I said to the super, hey, where is everyone? You have a really light crew today. And he said, well, I had a bunch of guys not show up because another project across town was hit by ice. And I said, well, I thought all your workers were here legally or they're citizens. He said, they are. They just don't want to get rounded up and have to prove it. And to me, it always boils down to what would a prudent person say or do. And that makes sense to me. Even if you have a legal person, they may not want to go through that hassle. So it's something we're keeping an eye on. It's pocketed worse in some areas than others, but it has had an impact. I'd like to give you a couple of comments as to why we're where we are with labor shortages. First of all, let's just look at, and by the way, I've done this seminar a few times and I've updated it. And I had someone ask me about union, and I said, you know what? Thank you. That's a good point. I'm going to add that in. Just to give you an idea, about 50 years ago, union labor in the country was 40% on construction sites, down 10%. Again, about 50 years ago, union workers made about 70% more. Now they make about 15% more. So that tells you what's happened to the union worker. What has that done? That's impacted apprenticeships, training, guilds where you had people that would go there with little or no skill, be trained and properly prepared under the right guidance and experienced workers and managers and supervisors, and then they'd be put out on their own to take the mantle and move things along. That has generally disappeared, and you see an impact. You see an impact that it doesn't exist like it used to. I had a project a few years ago here in New York City, and it was a union project, and it was a union construction concrete company. And I showed up early one day. I just happened to get there early, and I just had my coffee, and I just watched the construction workers work. And it was like poetry in motion. It was clean. They had a language of how they communicated. It was safe. They worked. It was coordinated. And the reason is, I was talking to one of the guys after, they all learned the same way. They all learned in the same shop. They all had the same terminology. They all had the same practices. So a lot of that's gone away. As a country, I think there's been a negative. And the negative is you haven't had that proper supply like we did for so long post-World War II of those skilled tradespeople to come in and learn their trades. What do we need this year, 2026? Well, the numbers vary based on who you read. About 300,000 more home builders. We need about 1.5 to 5 million more home starts. And if you're looking over the next 5 years, another stat I just saw was we need about 500,000 more mechanical workers over the next few years. This is a big alarm. This is a problem. This is a problem that has started to show itself and is only going to get worse. Another thing I'll tell you is a survey by the Association of General Contractors said the biggest delay in 2025 was labor, with 33% of firms saying it was an impact. So that tells you right there. The companies, the contractors are saying their biggest delay was labor, with a third of them saying it impacted their actual schedules. So your 16-month is 20 months. Your 22 months is 30 months, whatever that might be. And those are big numbers. Okay, now that we're looking at kind of the labor, we have some shortages, and we're going to talk about some things we can do or how that will manifest itself. What about interest rates? Is that going to impact our volume? Is that going to impact things? I'll say a couple things. And again, I'm certainly no economist. I'm just bringing these numbers to you. Interest and short-term rates decline gradually over the next few years. That seems to be the professional thinking. Was about 4.5% last year. It's now about 3.75. It has come down a little. And this should stimulate construction activity by making borrowing more affordable. I will also tell you that post-COVID, and I don't know if you all do this, but I find myself doing this. I graduated college in 94, and I always thought, well, I'm going to kind of judge my career out by the millennium, right? Everything's going to be, that was before the millennium or after. I don't. I judge my career based on three things that really were very impactful for our world. And this is from my working world: 9/11, the Great Recession, and COVID. And those three things in different ways really impacted a lot of what we do and how we communicate, how we get around, how we work. So, now we're 5 years, 6 years out of COVID, which is interesting because it's enough of a window that we all remember it very well. But when you look back, you could say, what's happened since then? Well, I could tell you from 2020 to 2024, affordable housing in the country has boomed. 310,000 units were built, including 91,000 units last year. The hottest markets last year, San Antonio, Phoenix, Charlotte, New York City, and Atlanta, led the way. But coming out of COVID, we've seen this real boom of affordable housing. And we believe that with the rates where they are, where things seem to be going, a lot of the discussions we're having with our clients, they're pretty bullish on this year. Rates look good, markets look good, people have come back to work. So I think that it shows that it's going to be some stimulation, and we should see that as the year goes on. How about supply chain? I'm here to report some good news. When we think supply chain in our world, in construction, we think of, again, back into COVID, 2020, the machine got shut off. Everything was turned down. Everything was shut down. And in order to get that machine supplying materials back up to 100% or close to it, it was not a switch. It was a dial. It was slow. So coming out of COVID, it took a few years for us to see real returns to pre-COVID. A lot of us don't realize, I do because I'm a nerd and I investigate this stuff, but you don't realize just when you walk in a building, you walk in a construction site, how many countries, how many companies, how many ports, how many roadways, how many truckers, etc., have brought that material to you. We are a true global industry for construction, and it comes from all over the globe. And we had a lot of problem coming out of COVID. I will say some supply chain issues will persist, but right now we're basically back to before COVID. So the good news is, from a supply chain, that became such a topic of discussion in 2020, 2021, even 2022. It's really not much of an issue now, aside from certain things. For example, electrical switchgear. Keep an eye on that. Find out what your due date is. When is it hitting the port? When is it coming from overseas? That's one that is a supply chain question. Big electrical switchgear. You also could have custom materials, custom windows or facade system, custom panels, custom mechanical equipment, generators. We have a lot, coming out of Sandy, for example. And again, you have this thing in engineering we call tombstone engineering. It's not very pleasant, but we have an issue, and we as an engineers say, okay, well, what do we do now? Coming out of Sandy, we had a lot of buildings in New York City that didn't have power. Guess what? The code was changed. You now have to put emergency generators in new buildings. It's a good thing. But what does that do? That puts a stressor on the supply of emergency generators, as an example. So when you had weatherization projects really, really hit the mark, 20, 25, even 15 years ago, what happened? Windows took a long time to get because they were very busy manufacturing windows. So keep an eye on custom deals. Keep an eye on something coming from overseas that maybe is going to take a little longer, and electrical switchgear. But I'm happy to report pretty much back to pre-COVID level now as far as supply chain. Some policy will drive volatility, and we're going to get into tariffs in a moment. And of course, political or war, regional impacts, supply chain could be impacted that way. So that's something we always keep an eye on. But the good news is, if supply chain issues, if I'm using a school grade, coming out of COVID was an F, we're now at about B plus and A minus now. So it's not perfect, but we're pretty much business as usual. As far as inflation's concerned, again, I'm just reporting what folks seem to say and what we've seen last year. Um, the interesting thing is this, and I'm going to get into tariffs now. If you asked me what impact did tariffs have, or do you believe they're going to have on different materials, I can honestly say I have no idea. And the reason I have no idea is because I don't know which tariffs are here to stay, which tariffs are here to increase, or which tariffs are here to decrease. And nobody knows except how the tariffs change. So the bad news is we can't rely on that. And I know that people ache when they can't plan this out. And on something that's volatile, something that's a question mark is a risk. We don't like risks. So I wanted to look at this and say, okay, forget about 2026 for the moment, although I'm going to get into that. How did 2025 actually end up? And what's interesting is, after some early year spikes, pricing kind of normalized mid-year 2025. The big ones to keep an eye on were steel was up about 15 to 25%, aluminum 8 to 10%, lumber's up, and concrete saw a large mid-year jump. Generally speaking, and I'm going to get into numbers in a moment, there was a April push up, there was a late summer push up, and then things pretty much normalized to where the pricing was. But it was very difficult to forecast that, not knowing where the tariffs were going to go. But I'm going to get into some details now. So, the interesting thing is I do webinars and seminars all the time. I think I looked at it recently. Last year, I think I did 28 last year. So that's 28 hours of this. This is the only one where I actually have a white piece of paper next to me with handwriting on it, because it changes every day. It just changes all the time. So let me tell you a little bit about where we are for tariffs, a little bit about where we're going, and then we'll tie it together to say, what does that really mean for my costs? So generally speaking now, as of 121, I'd like to say that's current, but let's say as of 121, Mexico 25%, Canada 25%, China 20%. So that's where we are right now, generally speaking, for those three countries. Steel 25% for all countries, aluminum 25% for all countries. Okay, so now I've showed you a few countries that are the biggest topics. Now I'm showing you some materials. And the other thing I'll say is reciprocal tariffs that other countries impose in the US. The other thing I'd like to report to you now, which is new, is the following. The United States government took the stance in about March or April that we were going to have reciprocal tariffs. So whatever you wanted to charge us as a tariff, country X, Y, or Z, we're going to charge you. And what's basically happened is now they're doing the same thing. So these other countries are now giving their reciprocal back to us. So that's where we are for a lot of countries. So let's take a look at specific trades and what we need to consider when we look at this. Okay, so first of all, again, like I started this conversation, I'm not looking at automobiles and clothing and that sort of thing. I'm looking at construction costs. I'm looking at the job site. So for construction, for just U.S. construction, in 2023, about 7% of all materials were imported. 2024, about 7% were imported. 2025, it was 9%. And I didn't understand that. When I looked at that recently, that didn't make sense to me. What actually happened is a lot of the shifts happened from higher tariff countries to lower tariff. And that was a big change. That was a big change, but didn't really impact the fact that it's still a imported material. Tariffs on China and Mexico pushed some sourcing back to US, but we actually saw import growth. And the interesting thing is twofold. Number one, you need to keep in mind that a lot of imported materials are actually raw materials in the US. As an example, 45% of metals that come into this country go right into manufacturing in this country. So you can buy a product that is a metallic based product made in a plant in Georgia, but they bought that metal from China or Vietnam or Canada or wherever, whoever it might be. So remember that 45% marker means that all that stuff coming in may not look like imported material if you're buying from a Georgia plant, but it is. It's impacted by it. And that was a big factor. The other thing that we saw happen, and again, I would see this and I would talk to supers and they would say, yeah, that we're seeing that as well, is that a US company saw this as I want to be kind. I don't want to sound like they're price gouging. They saw this as an opportunity to increase their profit a little bit. So as an example, if you're looking to buy some material you need and you can get it for $100 for a plant in, well, let's stay with Georgia, $100 from a plant in Georgia, or you can get it for 80 from a company in China, you're going to get it from China for 80. Now all of a sudden, tariff comes along. Let's say that 80 is now 130. Guess what? That plant in Georgia did not stay at 100. They came up to 120 because they can. And because of that, they leveled the playing field. And some of that money didn't come to the States because it was similar enough that people would keep it overseas. So there were some unintended consequences that happened. But generally speaking, 7, 8, 9% is where we are as an imported material as an industry over the last few years, just to set it to context. Now, if that's overall, that's fine. But let's look at some specific trades. And again, this is where I think the rubber meets the road. This is where I think you need to say, well, how is it really going to show itself in the price tag? Don't tell me about the labor, Willie. Just show me the baby. So this is where it breaks down to trade by trade. As an example, I'm going to show you the CSI, the Construction Specifications Institute categories, which we're all very familiar with, and how you should think about that if you're looking at a deal, if you're analyzing the risk of a deal, and you want to know how your impact could be from tariffs. So, for example, some of the CSI trades, which I'm going to show you in a minute, concrete, masonry, steel and metals, etc. So how do these get impacted by tariffs? And this is really what we all should know so we know how it's going to impact our costs. Well, first of all, one of the categories is existing conditions, including site work. About 5% of materials is imported. And the reason it's very low is it's mostly local, very labor-driven, rough raw materials. So that's kind of a weird category, but I wanted to keep it in because it is a CSI category. Let's move to concrete. Okay, so concrete. We know what concrete is. About 20% of concrete materials are imported. You'd think, oh, well, that's probably rebar, reinforcing steel, reinforcing bar, that was made from recycled plants in China. You'd be right, but Portland cement largely comes from Canada. Now, here's the interesting thing to think about concrete. Generally speaking, it's local water. Okay, that's not an import. Sand, that's not an import. Stone, that's not an import. And it's made locally in a plant, which means it's not an import. So if you have ready mixed concrete and you're making it in a plant and you're bringing it by trucks, it's not being made overseas. It's being made locally because I need to service that load of concrete before it cures. So even though rebar and Portland cement were big imports, it's generally a local product. And I'll show you how that impacted the cost, not as great as other things in a moment. Masonry is pretty similar, about 15% imported, welded wire mesh, but again, mostly local plant, local labor. So it's kind of like the lower tech concrete and masonry are more local labor force, therefore they weren't as impacted by the tariffs quite as much. Now, metals is where we change the conversation. About 30% of metals were imported as an industry last year. And this covers a variety of things. This is aluminums and steels, and it's structurals, and it's framing, and it's materials that goes into HVAC work, etc. So the metals are a big impact. And I think everyone would pretty much know that. Everyone would pretty much feel that. Okay, what about woods, plastics, and composites? About 25% imported. We get a lot from Canada. We make very good trees here. They make a little better trees, or at least they make more of the good trees because they're a little colder. And colder trees, longer growing trees are stronger trees, which is why, if you look at, you hear the term, oh, they don't make it like they used to. And sometimes that's true, sometimes that's not. But I could go into a building that's going to be gut renovated, and I look at these joists from 100 years ago. As long as they're not notched too much or damaged by water or fire, that's a stronger piece of wood than you'll buy today, because that was a 100-year-old tree. Your wood today is a 20-year-old farmed tree. So we get a lot of wood from Canada. We do a great job of making wood and lumber in this country, no doubt, but we get a ton from them. And by the way, that's your single family home. So whenever you hear single family home, your single family home is wood frame. So everything's going to be driven from that. If there's some freak thing that happens and wood and lumber goes up a certain amount in a certain day, watch single family home production, because it's absolutely going to be impacted. Thermal and moisture protection, about 10% imported. Not a big deal of import. Insulation, waterproofing, largely domestic. Openings, doors and windows. So here you go. You're thinking about doors and windows. You're looking at a project. You're analyzing a budget that was sent by a developer. About 25% imported. Not a ton, but that's still going to be felt. They're largely domestic manufactured, and raw materials and metals are typically imported. So that's where you're going to see that unintended consequence. You could take crystal windows here in Queens, and they're produced here in the States. That's great. But I'm going to guess they get materials from overseas, which may have been subject to a tariff. By the way, here's just a map of kind of like to show you where the lumber comes from Canada. The nice colder areas, that's where we get a lot of that wood. It also lines up to where our more populated cities are in the Northwest and in the Northeast. Finishes. Okay, how has finishes been impacted? About 20% of materials are imported for finishes, paints, coatings, that sort of thing. Specialties. Now, this is kind of a catch-all category, about 15% imported, but this has custom fixtures or architectural elements. Here is a big one. And by the way, these numbers have changed. I just saw new numbers from last year. Equipment. This is a big one. About 50% is imported. Let me bring it down to brass tacks for you. Household appliances. 54% were from China. However, some of the new numbers I'm seeing is Vietnam has taken over China, but a lot of appliances come from overseas, and they come from China. That's going to impact your affordable housing apartments, your market rate apartments, your condos, your single family homes, refrigerators, ranges, microwaves, dishwashers. Over half from China. So that's a big one. Conveying equipment, that's elevators, about 50% imported. That makes sense. A lot of it is metals, heavy duty steel, imported components, and heavy steel, a lot of it. So you saw an impact to elevators. Fire suppression, plumbing, and HVAC, 25% imported. Many are domestically produced, but the raw materials vary from China, Canada, Mexico. Again, we're caught in this loop. We're producing it domestically, but the raw materials are still coming from overseas. Electrical, 35% imported. Advanced systems are even more imported. So that's a big one. And electrical, you've seen a real boom in electrical over the last few years. Data centers. There's been a ton of data center construction. There's some, pushback on that out there, et cetera. But that's a lot of electrical, a lot of material, and that's heavy duty design. So where does this put the ranking of the different materials? Well, the worst impacted from an import standpoint, equipment, elevator, electric, metals, HVAC. That's kind of your, worst impacted as far as an import. Your middle of the road, doors, windows, finishes, concrete masonry, and then your lesser ones are thermal moisture, site work. And I think that pretty much lines up with what most people's guts would tell them. So what does this actually mean? Now, this is where we really need to look at this. So what we did last year at the beginning of the year in February, and then we did maybe 4 more times over the year, 4 or 5, is the following. We actually built an Excel spreadsheet, and I lined up all the CSI trades, which I just showed you. Then I looked at each trade for 3 different construction types: a wood frame building, a poured in place concrete building, and a structural steel building. And I said, okay, for each one of those trades, what is the import percentage for the different countries, for those different trades, for that different building type? Then I said, well, how much of that money is for labor and materials? And we broke down an estimate for each trade in each building type from each country, what the impact would be. And then all we had to do is plug in, if China overall was 25%, 3%, or 50%, didn't matter. We just put the numbers in and we let it compute it out. Now, here's what's interesting. Our year-end estimate in March was about 7% wood frame would go up, 8% concrete would go up, and 12% steel would go up. That year-end estimate as of June was a little bit decreased, 3 to 5%. And the reason is we had a spike in April, and then it went down a little. And move on to the next slide. I'll explain why in a moment. Here's your actual. So this is actual. So our estimates were off. And our estimates were off for a few reasons. Biggest one being that the tariffs changed. But I'll go through that in a moment. So for building type, what we actually saw last year was wood frame was up about 5 to 8, poured in place concrete was up about 7 to 10, and structural steel was up 10 to 15. I'll tell you a couple things to remember from last year that we found interesting. One is the following, and this is also under the category of what can be done. Well, one thing that can be done is stockpiling, and a lot of stockpiling was done last year. There are a lot of companies, let's say a mechanical company, let's say you have a company here in the States that produces PTAC units. They purchased a lot of material in February and March before tariffs went into place. And they brought in all this material and the tariffs hit, but they didn't go up in price. They didn't go up in price because that material was stockpiled. They thought ahead, they bought ahead, and they were able to produce goods that didn't see that tariff impact for a while. That lasted till about the fall, and then we saw a spike. And the reason is they ran out of that stockpiling. That was a very real world thing that we saw. And it was interesting because I'm looking at numbers in the summer and saying, why aren't mechanicals going up more than I thought they would? And that was the reason. But then once that stockpiling ran out, now the material being bought on the tariff pricing is going to push the price up. So that was an interesting part of last year. What do we want to look for when we look for this? What do we kind of see when we look for this? And the other thing that I find interesting is when you look at the tariff, and I know that we all know this and we all see this in our everyday life, there's a tariff and there's a cost. So for example, if I say to you there's a tariff on aluminum coming in at 50%, 25%, 70%, what does that mean for you buying an air conditioning unit next weekend? That's really what you want to know. And what we found, which was very interesting, is in April and May, about 2/3 of the tariff was absorbed by the importer. So the importer, the company that had to pay the tariff, said to themselves, I don't want to lose these clients. I'm willing to take a profit hit. My profit margin is going to shrink a little in the short term because it's a lot harder to go get a client back than to keep a client. So they ate a lot of that at first. Again, about 1/3 and 2/3 are the numbers I saw. So that means in April or May, if they had a $100 increase, they're only passing $33 on to you. That was in April and May. By December, it was the opposite. They were passing along about 2/3. So that same $100 increase, they're passing along $66. And the reason is they couldn't sustain it forever. They could just sustain it for short term. So that is definitely something we saw, and the data backed it up. A couple other comments I'll make. Brazil, there's a tariff being floated out there of 50%. I don't know if that's going to come to fruition. There was a recent change the other day. India, their 25% tariff is down to 18%, as they agreed not to buy more Russian oil. So India's gone down to 18%. So that'll help there because they're a bigger and bigger producer moving forward. In fact, keep an eye on India. They're going to be the world producer probably on a lot of materials, cabinets, etc. So 25% down to 18%. The other thing I would keep an eye on is the short-term extension of the African Growth and Opportunity Act. So that's helped ease some pricing. And the last thing is that I'm keeping an eye on is there is a Supreme Court ruling out there that's coming any day or any week, any month here regarding the legality of some of the tariffs. And it doesn't look good for the Trump administration if you look at the lower courts and how they felt and what the Supreme Court seems to be leaning. If those tariffs are struck down by the Supreme Court, it's going to be interesting, to say the least. Because if that's true, again, I don't know if it's true, I don't have a crystal ball. If they do strike those tariffs down, it's not all of them, but it's a lot of them, and you're going to have an interesting reckoning where now, what about all those tariffs that were collected? How do you get that money back? How do you reconcile that? That's going to be a very, very interesting dynamic. I'm not saying it's going to happen, although it seems that way if you read the experts that are good at seeing where they think the Supreme Court is leaning. But again, we're keeping an eye on that. So what are we looking, go back one, please. So what are we looking for? Well, there's some things I'm looking for this year. First of all, it seems that broad construction cost pressure, about 4 to 6%. That seems to be what most of the experts think this year from 1/1 to 12/31, about 4 to 6% construction cost increase. That's not terrible. I think we could live with that. It's not 13 to 18%, but it's not 1 to 2%. And some project-specific spikes will be there, of course. If it's, like I said, the data center and those issues with certain trades that are going to spike more. I'd also look for volatility concentrated in materials tied to the tariffs, fabrication, and MEP. Again, that's the same volatility that we've been dealing with the last year. It's not going away. I don't think, and I've been following this pretty closely for a year with these tariffs, I don't think the volatility is going away. What I do think has been impressive is the markets, and the markets are not just Wall Street, it's the financial underwriting of a construction deal, have gotten better at dealing with these things. And we're not hitting the panic button, certainly. The biggest problem I see, which I know you all see as well, is the following. When it comes to underwriting and looking at a deal, we're looking at things not weeks or months, but years or a decade in the future. And when it comes to something like building a new plant in a domestic fashion for competing with and taking the work from an importing or an exporter from another country, this is something you all know that is years, if not a decade in the planning and the making. Take a new steel plant. I would love a new steel plant to open up in towns that they used to operate and shut down. Number one, steel manufacturing at the beginning of last year is about 85%. It's actually 84% at capacity. So they could handle a little more work, but not a lot. If you really want to grow that industry, not only do you need the workers, which we touched on, but you need to build that new plant to build that steel. That's a decade long. That's a decade project. And the problem is, not only we're not going to know about Trump's tariffs in a decade, we're going to have a different president. We're going to be on perhaps 2 presidents from now. So 3 even. So the point is, we don't know where all these things are going to go. And I think that volatility remains. I think that the industry, and which is really you all that are watching this right now, have done a great job of adjusting to it, just like COVID. We had to adjust. And I'll go through some other things in a moment, but the volatility is still there, but the panic is handling it better. Cost escalation, increasingly driven by labor, logistics, and procurement. That's something that we're going to keep an eye on. I don't think it's going to be out of control. I think that 4 to 6% seems right by everything I'm looking at. I'm curious about a falling dollar value. I remember talking to a hotelier in New York City. He was big time a few years ago, and he said, somehow it came up talking about inflation of the dollar. He said, well, if the dollar's strong, they're coming from Wisconsin. If it's weak, they're coming from Germany. I don't care. I'm putting heads in beds. And I went, that's an interesting way to look at it. Now, I don't think a falling dollar is great for us as a country overall, but I do think that we'll keep an eye on that. If metals go up from imports and dollars go down, our dollar goes less far, and therefore that's going to be even more of a pain point. And then, of course, geopolitical conflict regions, whether it's Ukraine, whether it's Israel, that's something we always keep an eye on to see how those manifest. Lumber. It looks like this year it's going to be generally stable. You could see some spikes. There have been a lot of mill closures over the last number of years in the States, unfortunately, and supply, it's not where it's a real advantage. So there could be some spikes there based on where and what you're looking for, but generally stable seems to be the thinking. Electrical, the increases still persist, driven by the long lead items and limited domestic manufacturing, which means you have to import it. So it's something to keep an eye on. I don't think it's going to go down to normals, a lot of the other materials. Manageable, and if I know what my risk is, I'm happy. If I don't know what my risk is, I'm unhappy. And I think that you're still going to see some risk there on switchgear. Concrete, we expect about 8 to 12% increases. This is largely labor and rebar driven, not the cement supply, which again, a lot of that comes from Canada. So keep an eye on your concrete costs. If you're doing a big foundation and ground up poured in place building, that's substantial. U.S. steel industry, they're up to about 75 to 80%. That's up from 74% about a year ago. So the good news is, as an American, I love the fact that a steel industry plant is saying, yeah, we're busier than we were 2 years ago. Great. That's terrific. But there's a lot that they can't do. They're not outfitted to mill and to make the structural steel anymore, or certain other kinds of steel. There's a lot of metals covers a huge umbrella of materials. So their capacity, they're not at 100. They're busier than they were a year ago, but there is some constraints there. So keep an eye on the tariffs. Keep an eye on what we can domestically source. And the other thing I'll say is, every time I've had a lender say, well, can't we just get that from in the States? Usually the answer is no. Usually the answer is no. We either don't make it, we don't make it on a competitive basis, or there's such a lead time because that plan is just so busy, it's not viable for the schedule we want for this project. So I'd love that to not be the case. It's the case. Softwood lumber, production remains constrained. So again, there were a lot of mill closures. We're keeping an eye on this. The bottom line of all this is expect normal, if not elevated, overall pricing, but not reduction. But I don't feel as unknown as a year ago. I feel like the unknown feeling we all had a year ago, out of 1 out of 10. I know I'm supposed to do a 1 out of 5 or 6, but I'm old school. 1 out of 10. Last year was probably 9 at this point. This year, I'd say it's probably 6. So yes, some pricing up. Yes, manageable. Yes, some spikes. But I think as an industry, we've got a fairly good feel of what's coming. What to look for in your projects. Okay, now we know what's coming. Now we know where the prices are. Now we know what might happen. What to look for. Number one, look for price escalation kickers in your contracts. This is something that you could see a pricing in a contract or subcontractor, and they'll have some language in there that if a certain tariff does this or that or stays as of this date, they're going to charge you for that addition. So they'll have a kicker. They'll have something in there that says that. I don't mind that. I kind of like that. I kind of like that someone says, look, I'm going to sell you this for $100, but if this material is proven to go up to this, it's going to be 120. It's a known. I love knowns. So even if a kicker is unknown of whether it's going to come to fruition, we at least agree on it. An example would be when we look at a general contract. If I say, hey, are you going to do underpinning on this job? We don't know yet. We won't know till we start. True, but I want to see a unit cost per cubic yard of concrete for underpinning. At least it's a known unit cost. I know you don't know if we're going to do it, but it's a known unit cost. So you might start to see more of that. Kickers in contracts. You might see a movement away from stipulated sum. And just to give you a quick one comparison, stip sum for CFP, the way we look at it and kind of the overall down and dirty explanation is stipulated sum, it's a set amount, no more, no less, closed book. Doesn't include general conditions. So if we're having a project that we're doing and it's a stip sum, and the general contractor says, I'll build you this building for $60 million. It's going to cost you $60 million. If they buy it for 62, it's going to cost you 60. If they buy it for 52, it's going to cost you 60. Change orders are different. A change order is an unforeseen condition and an unknown quantified scope in the project. That's not what I'm talking about. So you stip sum, you know your ceiling, you know your floor, you know your price, but it's a closed book. It's a closed book because they're not sharing with you how they're buying it out, because they're telling you, hey, don't worry about that, we're on the hook. A guarantee maximum price, similar, no more. Again, let's say it's $60 million. It may be less if they buy it out for less because they're good at their job, they have good relationships, etc. And the spoils or the profit is split between the developer and the GC. And that's an open book. The good news for the GMP is if you compare when does one happen with the other, if you have a known product you're building, like an affordable housing building, stip sum's a nice fit. If you have something that's in more of an unknown, like let's say it's a condo building that you're still working on layouts and appliance package and finishes, you might do a GMP. Okay, well, if that's the case, the more risk you have in the market, the less likely a GC is willing to do a stip sum, and the more they want to do a GMP, give a higher ceiling, but they're going to split any profit with you. So you might see a movement away from stip sum. I haven't seen it yet myself. I don't think we've seen it as a company, but I did read an article and an attorney's talking about they're expecting this. So I said, you know what? That's a good idea. I think it's something to mention. What else to look for in your actual construction pricing? Force majeure. It's outside of my control. I haven't really seen this. You might see it. Keep an eye on it. An example of this, I remember a number of years ago, there was a fire in an insulation factory, and overnight insulation went up 30%. And contractors came back to the bank and said, hey, this went up 30% overnight. That was outside of my control. I didn't know there's going to be a fire. And that's a force majeure. That's outside your control. I haven't seen it yet. You might. What else to look for? What goes up may not come down. I would be shocked if anything came down. If these tariffs go back to normal rates and etc., I would be shocked if they came down. Just to give you an example, by the way, our average construction tariff rate 2 years ago was about 4 to 5%. Last year, I think it was 17 to 18%, which is high as it's been since the 30s. So our tariffs are high as an average. If those tariffs go away, if we get better relationships with some of these countries and we don't have those high tariffs, I don't know if it's going to come down. I mean, that's usually not the way human nature works. We'll see. But what goes up may not come down. Changing the construction type, that sounds a lot easier than it is. It's very hard to go from a structural steel building to a concrete building or a wood frame building. One, from a code standpoint, and can you do it? And two, if you're any bit along in the plans to redo your project for a new construction type, you're probably throwing your schedule off kilter. You may take up any of the additional monies you would have saved. That's a really, really hard thing to do, changing construction type. Now, we have seen some things happen, like you can go away from, for example, we've seen some projects go away where it's applicable by code from metals with the mechanicals to plastics. That's one possibility. But a change in construction type, it sounds great. It's really hard to pull off in real life. And then the last one, and this we are starting to see when we're looking at budgets, there will be an additional contingency, a tariff contingency. We're starting to see that. I don't mind that because you don't get that right out of the gate, GC, but it's there just in case. And as long as we know what you're basing your pricing on, then you can prove what is not based in that pricing and therefore subject to being funded by the additional contingency. So I don't think it's a terrible idea, and we're starting to see that a little more. So that takes me to the end. I see that, one of the things I could say, if you wanted to know, the number one recommendation is LED. You have to communicate LED, loud, early, and decisive. Communicate early, pricing early, permit approval early, subcontractors early. How are we doing? What are your relationships? What the pricing? Can you store some materials in their plant so we can lock in pricing. Start early. And if you do that and you have those relationships, the AGCs, they seem to understand that much better than the B and C GCs. So we see that that usually works pretty well. So that takes me to the end. Hopefully you found this helpful, talking a little bit about where we were with tariffs, where we are and where we're going, the labor shortages, wink, wink, keep an eye on that. Supply chain risks are fairly normal. I would say that I go to a ton of holiday parties at the end of the year because I like to see folks and say, what do you see for next year? And I'll say what everyone seems to say, cautiously optimistic. So I think I'm cautiously optimistic for this year, particularly in affordable housing. So that's it. That is the conclusion of the webinar. If anyone would like to put any questions in the chat, I see I have one here already I'll comment on. And then if we have time, we might have a couple more. Someone asked about the Build America, Buy America impact. So it's interesting. That was I don't know, 3 or 4 years ago that was put in place. Build America, Buy America was federal monies that basically, when federal monies were used, the sourcing had to be from domestic suppliers. The latest I saw reading about that a few weeks ago is that's been really, really hard to do. A lot of materials just can't come domestically like we want and need on projects. So I don't know if that's been the quite success that you wanted. And I think that a lot of you would probably say, I'm not surprised by that. That's a really hard thing to do, just to start, shifting where we're bringing materials domestically if it's something that we haven't for decades and decades. Will you send the slides? We could send the slides out, absolutely. We also, like I said, we're going to put this up on YouTube for folks to see. I'm going to go to a next question here. We're getting a lot of pushback on buyout requests. What's the best way to address this in the current environment? Excellent question. So what's interesting about buyouts is the following. I have a whole different webinar I do on buyouts, which I'm doing later in the year. And there you go. There's my selfless plug. Come back in a few months. But one of the things I'll say is this. When you have that buyout, a couple things of cautionary tale. First of all, your GC can tell you your price all you want. But really, we need to know, what is this sub going to do this for? We really need to know the people that are going to buy, build, paint, install, pour, plumb this part of the job. What is the actual cost? The one thing I would tell you is that's a tough thing to answer when we're in a booming time like now. Now is a busy time. And the reason is that we're not willing to wait, that have the plans as far along as possible to get the best pricing. Because the earlier you get your buyout, the more likely you are to have change orders. And by the way, the GC is not going to be hurt by those change orders. They're going to be just fine. So the longer you wait for your plans maturation, the better. So you're setting that against pricing. So what I would say is this. If you have a typical ground up project, and again, I'm broad brushing here a little bit. If you have a typical ground up project, and we could say it's a poured in place, 12-story building in an urban setting, if you're shovel ready, you should be 60% bought out, because you should have already bought out. If you're shovel ready, you should have bought out excavation, foundation, superstructure, windows, temporary waterproofing on your facade, first ply waterproofing on your roof, underground plumbing, and facade. You should have 60% of your buyout done. So that's the good news. The one thing I would say is, we get a lot of pushback getting buyout from GCs, particularly if it's a stip sum. Often they'll even just give us a number. The problem I'll also caution you is when they give you a number, let's say they come back and say, hey, we just found out the poured concrete structure is going to be 8.5 million. That's great. When do we see that subcontract? Oh, that's weeks and weeks away, because those little details have to be worked out. How it's going to be paid, stored materials, retainage. So the number is great, but what we really want is that subcontract. So I would say if you can at least frame what you think the price is going to be before you get the subcontract, you at least put on paper what their price is. I know there's details to work out, but that's one thing I would definitely say if you could do in the beginning. And that's kind of the toughest thing with buyouts is you're pitting time versus certainty, and that's a tough scenario. outside of adjusting contingency requirements, how is the industry being impacted by and handling labor shortages resulting from ice raids? Yeah, it's a good question. I know that it's interesting. Here in New York City, so OSHA, just everyone's familiar with OSHA, I would assume. OSHA has the ability to walk on any construction site across the country unless it's a government project or tribal lands. OSHA has generally not been on New York City projects because for decades and decades, from what I've been told by old timers, and now I'm an old timer, so I tell others like you, is that New York City kind of said to OSHA, we got it. We have strict safety plan and requirements in place. We have trainings in place. We have certified construction supers and site safety managers, etc. We'll self-police. And that's actually true. New York City has very good, very strict safety regulations in place. OSHA has not shown up. I will tell you, and again, this is just amongst us friends, I have a few projects, 2 projects, where I heard that OSHA was showing up. Now, one person told me they think OSHA is showing up because they're looking at payroll and records to see who's on the site. What are they doing with that data? I don't know. But aside from the news and social media, I have not been on a project yet. I have not shown up on a project yet, and I haven't talked to any of our inspectors yet that I know of that there was a outright raid, an outright scooping up of employees. So it's not been near as impactful if I'm just looking at the construction site from a raid standpoint, but the fear has impacted it in certain circumstances. Okay, I think we're just about to time. Last question. Should GC be allowed to add insurance and profit to a tariff upcharge? That's an excellent question. I don't see why they would. A tariff upcharge, really, it's not any more labor. I don't believe, and again, I'm not an attorney, it's any more liability. I don't believe. Now, should the insurance matter because now that material is worth more, quote unquote, worth more, and therefore have a greater value for replacement in the COI? Maybe, but I don't believe it should be subject to a profit upcharge. But it's a good question. I would say the insurance, maybe if it's going to be a material funding, because insurance is different if I'm buying 500,000 worth of material or $1 million. So that's a good question. But I don't see why you'd add a profit overhead or GC onto it because it's a buildup of something that's already had a profit overhead and GC. I don't think it should be warranted. So I see we're at 2:00. I want to be very respectful of everyone's time. Thank you very much. I very much appreciate everyone attending. We have more of these coming up each month. They're all topical things that we've discussed with clients and they've asked for them. So I really hope people got some stuff out of this and share the word. Come to the next ones. And it's just great to be in front of you and to cover something that I think is topical and affects our everyday. So thank you very much for attending. I appreciate everyone. Have a good day. And if this applies to you, good luck in the snow.